what is your definition of kindness or moral ethics in those kind of tricky situations? How does then thick concepts work in those situations?
I think that thick concepts are largely neglected in moral philosophy.
Not a lot of our viewers would know the term normative judgments. So if you can just explain that, and then we can move on with understanding your claim.
The term normative just refers to evaluative claims about what's good or bad, and that includes thick evaluative claims. But I think that most meta-ethicists just don't think about thick concepts at all. So they just...
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Thakkar Show. Today we have Professor Debbie Roberts. She is head of Department of Philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. It's an honor to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah, I'm delighted to receive the invitation and looking forward to the discussion.
Brilliant. So we had we've gone through a lot of your research, and you've done a lot of research on something called thick evaluative concepts. So can you just help us understand what exactly this term is, and then maybe we can go deeper into it?
So it might seem like there should be a straightforward answer to that, because thick evaluative concepts come up in the literature in moral philosophy quite a bit, and you might think that, oh, people know what they're talking about and everyone agrees on what they're talking about, but actually exactly what thick concepts are is quite controversial. I guess an easy place to start is to say that people think that thick concepts are concepts that look like they combine different kinds of content. So if we contrast them with thin concepts and with non-evaluative concepts, thick concepts look like they are concepts that combine evaluation and non-evaluation. So to give some examples, if you think a thin evaluative concept is something like good or bad or right or wrong, why is it thin? Well, because it seems like those concepts are quite purely evaluative. They don't really tell you very much about the thing that you're applying the concept to, except they give you the evaluation. And if you think that a non-evaluative concept is something like yellow or solid, that doesn't evaluate, does describe, but it doesn't evaluate. Thick concepts somehow combine. Well, the idea is that they seem to combine those two types of content. So for example, if you call a person kind or courageous or generous, or if you describe a painting as elegant, or if you describe, I guess usually that's the examples that come to mind to me are sort of usually descriptions of people or actions. So what the person did was crass or rude or whatever. There it looks like you are evaluating. All of these concepts carry with them a positive or negative evaluation, but you're also giving some more concrete, specific information. So it's not simply a thin evaluation like good or bad. It's telling you something more concrete, or it's telling you something thicker. So that's where the idea comes from. Beyond that, exactly what thick concepts are, then it gets kind of controversial. What people say beyond that initial, it seems like they combine these two different kinds of content. Beyond that, it gets very controversial, and different people with different meta-ethical views have different stories to tell about exactly what's going on.
Right. So, and how do they sort of like shape our moral understanding? Because concepts like kindness, courageousness, everyone has their own sort of definition in their own context, or in the context of a particular situation, or maybe because there's this very famous experiment that usually is like, you need to pull the lever. If you pull the lever, one person, but that's your family member or your loved one, would die, and if you don't, then five strangers would die. What what is your definition of kindness or moral ethics in those kind of tricky situation? How does then thick concepts work in those situation?
So I guess the first thing to say is that I think that thick concepts are largely neglected in moral philosophy. So someone whose work I really admire is Bernard Williams, and one of the things that he says in his book Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy is that moral philosophers don't pay enough attention to the wide range of moral concepts that we have available to us. What happens in moral philosophy is that people tend to focus on the thinner concepts, what's good or bad or right or wrong. So typically, those kinds of trolley cases, what people are doing is they're thinking about two different approaches to ethical theory. You can be a deontologist or you can be a utilitarian. Um, if you're a utilitarian, you're focusing on maximizing the good. If you're a deontologist, you might think that there are certain rules that you ought to follow. And even if you were to maximize the good, there's certain things that you should never do. Um, Focusing on thick concepts and focusing on a wider range of moral concepts just totally changes our approach to philosophy, I think. And one thing that it does is that I think it takes us away from those kinds of thought experiments and asks us to think about more concrete, particular real life cases, right? So we're not looking for general principles. We're not looking for answers to these kinds of weird, abstract philosophical cases. What we're doing is we're thinking about particular everyday situations that people might find themselves in. And we're thinking about not just how should I evaluate this situation, what should I do in any kind of overall sense, but we're thinking about what's the correct description? How should we describe what's going on here? And I think that that question is actually an ethical question in lots of cases. So to give you a concrete example, say you see someone who is, I don't know, teasing someone else, and you're trying to work out what's the right description of what's going on here. There are lots of different descriptions, that might be appropriate. It could be that it's just a bit of good-natured banter, or it could be that this is bullying. And once we work out what the correct description is, often the correct evaluation will just fall out of that. So if it turns out that it happens that the correct description is that actually this person is being bullied, then it might seem obvious that, well, that's bad and that's wrong. And so we ought to do something about it. Um, so I think neglecting thick concepts has led to us neglecting the fact that it's really important how we describe concrete situations. And description is, in fact, an ethical matter. Um, so someone else whose work I admire and who influences my view is Iris Murdoch, and John McDowell, also influenced by Murdoch. And they both emphasize that seeing clearly, seeing reality clearly, is about using the right concepts. And that's true for moral concepts as well. And once you see reality clearly, once you're using the right concepts, it often becomes very obvious what the correct evaluation is and what the right thing to do is. So paying more attention to thick concepts, I think, really does enhance our moral understanding a great deal in ordinary everyday life.
Interesting. Yeah, I do kind of agree on like we do need uh, the understanding of the thick concepts to sort of describe better in the bullying case, one of the examples that you gave. Because even as a real life impact, it would sort of help a lot in terms of understanding a lot of contextual based situation as well, which would then sort of give us a better understanding of uh, what and how should we sort of approach it uh, in real life. Now, like going forward in one of You sort of challenge the idea that normative judgments like simply supervene non-normative facts now, because not a lot of our viewers would know the term normative judgments. So if you can just explain that, and then we can move on with understanding your claim.
So, when moral philosophers talk about normative judgments, what they mean is just, judging that some action is right or wrong, or judging that a person is good or bad, or an institution is fair or unfair. Those are normative judgments. So the term normative just refers to evaluative claims about what's good or bad, and that includes thick evaluative claims, or claims about things like rightness or wrongness, or what you should or shouldn't do, right? So that's what normative means. The claim that the normative supervenes on the non-normative is a technical philosophical claim. Supervenience is a technical term, and supervenience is often explained by reference to other things. So, for example, you might think that the aesthetic qualities of a painting supervene on the actual particles of paint on the canvas, right?
Hmm.
Supervenience is often understood to be a kind of dependence relation, but really, technically, it's a claim about necessary covariance. What does that mean? Well, if you've got two classes of properties, if they necessarily covary, it means that one can't change without the other changing. And in slogan form, supervenience is the idea that you can't have an A difference without a B difference. So the claim that the normative supervenes on the non-normative is that you can't have a normative difference without a non-normative difference. To give you an example, if you have two actions that have all of the same non-normative properties, so all the bodily movements are exactly the same, all the causal relations are exactly the same, all the physical stuff that happens is exactly the same, completely identical in all non-normative respects. The supervenience claim is that they must then be identical in evaluative respects as well. And if they're different, then there must be some non-normative, underlying non-normative difference. So two actions say one can't be fair and the other unfair without there being some other difference between them. It would be weird if they were exactly the same in all other respects, but one was fair and one was unfair. So there's necessary covariance between the normative and the non-normative. Is that clear?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it's very common in metaethics to say that the normative supervenes on the non-normative. You can't have a normative difference without a non-normative difference. They necessarily are in step. But I think that most metaethicists just don't think about thick concepts at all. So when they're thinking about moral stuff or when they're thinking about normative stuff, they're just thinking about the thin and about the non-normative. They've forgotten about the thick altogether. And if you think, like me, that the thick stuff belongs on the descriptive side of things, that's a way of describing situations, then you might think that, well, sure, there can't be a normative difference. Say one person can't be good and another person bad without there being some other differences. But you might question whether those other differences have to be non-normative differences. There might be, there have to be further differences, but they might themselves be evaluative differences. It might be because say we've got two actions, one is bad, one is not bad, and you say, well, there's got to be some further difference, and it might be that in the case of the bad action, it's an instance of bullying. In the case of the good action, it's an instance of friendly banter. And you might question whether we can always spell out the differences between these actions fully in non-normative terms. So another philosopher whose work I like a lot is Joseph Raz. And he emphasizes that our ability to apply evaluative concepts very often is on the basis of other evaluative concepts that we've applied. And our ability to do that and to discriminate between different kinds of situations in evaluative terms far outstrips our ability to do it in non-evaluative terms. And if you ask someone for their reasons, if you ask them, well, why was that banter? Why was it not bullying? It's not clear that you're always going to be able to spell out fully those differences in completely non-evaluative terms. So I guess I question supervenience because I question the idea that our evaluative judgments or our evaluative concepts or our normative judgments more broadly always can, that you can always find underlying non-normative judgments that those are based on. Now, supervenience is complicated, and there are lots of different kinds of supervenience claims. What I've been talking about is a claim about judgments or concepts. But some people want to say that, well, just forget about that. When I talk about supervenience, I'm just talking about the metaphysics, I'm just talking about properties. So you might hear someone saying, well, okay, what you've said about concepts, sure, that's fine. But the supervenience claim is still true if we talk about actual features of the world and not concepts or judgments. So if something is good, if something has the property of goodness, and some other action is identical in every single other respect, then it also must have the property of goodness. And I want to say, how do we know that that's true? The main argument for that metaphysical claim is what's called a conceivability argument. It says, well, we can't imagine, we can't imagine these things that are identical in every respect but differ in evaluative respects. Or we can't imagine, a standard example is the Rwandan genocide, right? We can't imagine something that is absolutely identical to the Rwandan genocide, but it is actually ethically wonderful. Now, I think that those conceivability arguments are dodgy because we're constrained by our available concepts. And again, I think that people who make those kinds of conceivability arguments are just assuming that when they say, oh, we're holding all the non-evaluative stuff fixed, they're just assuming that that's all that you need in order to get the thin evaluative property. If we're imagining two situations that are exactly identical in every single respect, then I agree, they're going to have the same evaluative properties. That's true. But if we're imagining two situations that are exactly identical only in their non-evaluative respects, then I don't know. I mean, are they going to have, you might have...
Can you give any example of that?
So sticking with the Rwandan genocide, say we take out, so we're not just thinking about thin stuff, right? We're thinking about thick stuff as well. And we've got to take all of the evaluative stuff out of what we're imagining. Okay, so take out that it was a genocide. So take out brutality, take out cruelty, take out, I think harm is an evaluative thing. Take all of those things out. Like, what are you left with, right? Some people killed some other people.
Mm-hmm.
That could have been a terrible accident. It need not have been a genocide. So that's a kind of simplified version of a much longer argument. But if you take R.M. Hare's example, so he says, think about St. Francis of Assisi, right? He was a very virtuous person. He was a good man. Right? Now imagine someone who has all the same character traits. Of course, that person is also going to be good. And Hare thinks that this proves that the evaluative supervenes on the non-evaluative, or the normative supervenes on the non-normative. But I want to say, well, if we've got to if we're making sure that we're not imagining this person with all the same thick properties, if we're taking all the thick stuff out of what's called the supervenience base, then how do we know that we do actually have a duplicate that is going to have the same thin evaluative property? I mean, what have we got if we take out all of the virtues, which are thick? We take out all of the thick stuff, then we've got a person with some character traits. And yeah, sure, those things can differ evaluatively. Because we're constrained by the concepts that we have, and because the main argument for the metaphysical thesis is a conceivability argument that goes through our existing concepts, I think that we can't know a priori if the metaphysical supervenience claim is true or not.
Interesting. You sort of answered my next question as well. So, like, how does then these thick concepts play a role in science? Because I have a small background in science, so I would love to know any sciencey stuff attached to philosophy. So, how does thick concept play a role in science? Because usually what we understand of science is very black and white.
Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting work on thick concepts in science that's currently taking off. So Anna Alexandrova at Cambridge has done a lot of interesting work recently on thick concepts in science. And more generally, she's interested in values in science and how values in science actually doesn't undermine objectivity. So I'm interested in that in general, partly because I want to defend a kind of realist view, and partly because I want to defend a kind of naturalist realist view, not a reductive naturalist realist view, which I guess might be a technical term that needs a little bit of explanation. So a reductive naturalist in metaethics is someone who thinks that, well, they're a realist view who thinks, well, there are moral properties. Like there is a property of goodness out there in the world, it's real, but it can be reduced to something that we might think of as might more ordinarily think of as natural. To take a really toy example, so you might think, well, goodness is just maximizing pleasure, badness is minimizing pain, something like that. Like you can reduce those properties to something which is uncontroversially natural. I want to defend a view which says that moral properties are real, there are moral facts, but they're not real because we can reduce them to something else, right? They're real and natural in their own right. And I think that thinking about the role that thick concepts play in science can actually help me defend that kind of realist view. Why do I think that? Well, I'm partly inspired by arguments that Platonists in philosophy of maths make, right? So you get some people, Platonists in philosophy of maths, who want to say numbers are real, right? Why are they real? Well, one argument is because they're indispensable to science. Like we could not do science without numbers. And the sort of short version of the argument is, okay, if you're committed to something in your scientific theorizing, then it's kind of intellectually dishonest at the end of the day to turn around and say, oh, but yeah, no, those are not real. A more careful way of making that argument is to say not just that numbers are indispensable to science, but that quantification over mathematical entities is indispensable to explanation in science. Like we need to use mathematical entities to explain stuff in the world. So, for example, Platonists have used the existence of prime numbers, they've argued for the existence of prime numbers based on the life cycle length of cicadas, like that those life cycles are prime are very important in explaining why cicadas have the life cycles that they do. And there are other examples like that. And I think that there are analogous cases for thick evaluative concepts in science, particularly in the human and the social sciences. So Anna Alexandrova's work focuses particularly on cases to do with well-being and child development. So I think both of those are thick concepts. But you find this in economics, so poverty, inflation. There is this concept in economics called rational addiction, the concept of risk. All of these are thick concepts, I think, and they figure in scientific theories and they figure in specific explanations of phenomena. You find lots of these concepts in psychology, so kindness figures in social psychology, for example, as part of particular explanations. So acts of kindness positively impact well-being is one particular example. But you also find these concepts in biology and ecology. So biodiversity is a good example, adaptation, and invasive species. These are thick concepts that figure in scientific theories to describe the very phenomena that science is investigating, right? They're evaluative concepts. They describe phenomena that scientific theories are investigating, and they figure in specific explanations. I want to argue that they figure indispensably in those explanations. We can't find any other concept that's going to do the job, right? We have to use those concepts. And I want to use that to argue for the existence of evaluative properties, right? Because these concepts identify real phenomena in the world that science is investigating, that figure indispensably in scientific investigations. That gives us a good reason to believe that they exist. That's a really kind of shortened version of the project, and this is a sort of new avenue of research for me. So I'm currently working on these questions together with my colleague Joe Wolfe, who's a philosopher of science. And at the moment, we're thinking about invasive species in particular. If you're interested in this kind of angle, so philosophers who have really influenced my thinking here, Hilary Putnam and John Dupre. John Dupre is particularly interesting, I think, because he has a very interesting view on what naturalism is. Because one thing I should say about my view is that I'm not a big fan of the traditional natural, non-natural distinction in metaethics. I don't think that's a really helpful distinction. I don't think it's very well made. And I think it'd be really great if metaethicists just gave up on it and just started talking about reductive or non-reductive realist views.
I mean, you've talked about metaethics in general. So, for any student who is sort of interested in going into the field of metaethics, how would you describe that transition between sort of naturalism and non-naturalism in relation to specifically thick concepts?
So I think probably the easiest way into figuring out what a non-naturalist view is to think about the work of G.E. Moore. He's really the person that we get the view non-naturalism from. And the way that he thinks of it is his chosen focus is goodness, right? And the way that he thinks of it is, well, goodness is not something that we can identify with any other natural property, right? Why not? Well, any time you try and define good, it's never going to work, he thought. So if I say something like, oh, well, good is getting what you desire, Moore is going to say, well, no, because when you get what you desire, it's always an open question whether or not that's good. Right? If good was getting what you desire to desire, it wouldn't be an open question. It would be closed. It would be like someone saying, this is a closed three-sided figure, but is it a triangle? Like that's a closed question. But anytime we try and define good, it never works because we can always ask an open question, right? So good is indefinable, Moore thought.
Right.
And the fact that it's indefinable, he thought, gave us good reason to think that it is non-natural. It's of its own kind. It's so it's hard to characterize exactly what Moore meant by that, because as soon as you say the term non-natural, you immediately get the vibe that you're talking about something spooky, or, it's really mysterious, like what could it be? Where does it exist? All those kinds
Yeah.
of questions. I think probably the easiest way to think of it is just that Moore thought that moral properties were their own special kind of thing, not unlike certain views in philosophy of mind, right? So
Hmm.
if you take someone like David Chalmers, who thinks that consciousness is its own special thing, it's
Hmm.
not reducible, it's of its own kind. Moore thought that about moral properties. And
Interesting.
he called that non-naturalism.
So you talked about metaethics. So how can someone who is interested, a student who is interested in metaethics and would want to explore more uh, and understand transition of non-naturalism, from naturalism to non-naturalism, um, how would they look into the metaethics uh, in relation to thick concepts, especially?
Um, so I'd say if you're particularly interested in non-naturalism, a good place to start is with G.E. Moore, who he is really responsible for the existence of the view, the non-naturalist view, and in many ways. He's not the only person, but certainly extremely influential. And understanding the difference between naturalists and non-naturalist views, I think the best way into that is to think about Moore's open question argument. Um, so Moore argues that, and his focus is goodness, he argues that goodness has to be its own special kind of property because it's indefinable, right? We can't come up with any definition for good which yields a closed question. What's a closed question? Well, we have a definition for a triangle. It's a closed three-sided figure. So if someone says, you know, it's a closed three-sided figure, but is it a triangle? They're asking a closed question. But for any definition that we can come up with for goodness, Moore thought, we could ask, well, uh, you've got what you desire. Is that good? That's an open question. Or you've maximized pleasure. Is that good? Again, an open question. So whatever definition we can come up with, we can ask an open question. And he thought, to cut a long story short, and there are some other details in between there, that this meant that we should accept that moral properties are of their own kind. They're sui generis, as he said. And he called them non-natural. Now, I have some issues with that terminology. I don't think that non-natural is a good term or a helpful term to have used. A way to think about Moore's views, to think about certain views in philosophy of mind. So you have people like David Chalmers who think that consciousness is its own special thing. It can't be reduced to the physical. It's its own special kind of thing. And that's what Moore thought about goodness and moral properties in general. I think in general, a good way into metaethics, there's some good textbooks out there. So my colleague Matthew Chrisman has written a really good introduction to metaethics. The Stanford Encyclopedia articles on all of these topics. So the Stanford is slightly more advanced than Matthew's textbook, but the Stanford Encyclopedia is a good place to start with these topics. When it comes to thick concepts, how thick concepts interact with naturalism and non-naturalism is quite complicated. So I guess the first thing that I'd say is that I have a particular view about the nature of thick concepts, which is controversial. But I think that thick concepts, you can't separate out non-evalative and evalative
Hmm.
content. It's kind of, I don't know if it even makes sense to think about there being two different kinds of content. It's just so enmeshed. It's really just one thing. And that's a problem if you want to defend any kind of reductive view. Why? Well, so here's a way to think about it. You might think, okay, let's separate everything, all concepts, all terms, into two piles, the evaluative pile and the non-evaluative pile. And really what we're doing when we reduce is that we're reducing what's in the evaluative pile to the non-evaluative pile. For that to work, it has to be that we can sharply separate these things into two piles. But if you've got genuinely thick concepts, you can't do that, right? Now you might say, well, okay, just put them into the evaluative pile and then we'll reduce them to the non-evaluative. But I think that if you do that, if you put them into the evaluative pile, you take them out of the non-evaluative pile, this goes back to what we were saying earlier. I think you need the thick concepts in order to be able to properly characterize, properly describe, right? To properly characterize what's called the base. So if you think about, there's the supervening properties and there's the base, and reductionists want to say we just reduce the supervening to the base. I'm saying, well, thick concepts make that really tricky because thick concepts are in both camps, right? And in order for this procedure to work, you have to be able to have a sharp separation between these two things. And it doesn't work if you take the thick concepts out. You don't have enough here to affect the reduction.
Mm-hmm. Like if in a simpler concept, if I would understand that, it's more of like you're removing the context out of the picture, and then you want, and then you're trying to understand it. And then context sort of plays a more nuance, gives a more nuanced understanding, and gives us sort of more information to make a decision or understand a particular incident more correctly. Like you can just say if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So that goes back to what I was saying about how describing is actually an ethical activity. So Iris Murdoch, um, well, this is really Hilary Putnam talking about Iris Murdoch, said that look, what we learn from Iris Murdoch's writing is that the description that we need when we're thinking about how to evaluate a situation or when we're trying to work out what to do, the description that we need is not some sort of neutral scientific description and is not bureaucratic jargon. We need the description of a sensitive novelist. And to give that description, we need thick concepts, right? And that really does give a much more nuanced picture of precisely what your context is. I guess I should also say that I'm sympathetic to Jonathan Dancy's views in ethics. So Dancy is a particularist, a moral particularist, who thinks that I mean, I think this is not his official view, but I think he thinks there are no moral principles. Which is not to say that he thinks that there aren't any right or wrong moral answers. He just thinks that the way to get those answers is not to apply principles, it's to pay very careful attention to the details of the particular case. So context really matters.
Yeah, interesting. So if if an undergraduate or someone like me who just directly pops into philosophy in master's degree, how what advice would you have for them, and how should they sort of start getting into the field of metaethics? What because you said a lot about you gave a lot of literature for us to go through, but then if there's any kind of thinking or any kind of perspective that one should start on understanding these concepts, uh, then that would be grateful.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of if you're interested in meta ethics, generally, then I would recommend starting with the textbooks and the Stanford Encyclopedia. I think those are great places to start. But if you're interested in, particularly in the ideas that I have been talking about, so thick concepts and their importance for moral understanding and their importance for description and describing situations, then actually I think reading novels, watching films, um, and thinking about novels and films from that perspective, thinking about descriptions, thinking about how you accurately describe situations and what concepts it's best to use in describing situations. I think that is another way into it. And then I guess I can I can tell you all the people that have influenced me, the people whose writing have led me down this sort of thick concepts path, if you like. So Bernard Williams's book, Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, I would recommend that. Iris Murdoch, The Sovereignty of Good. John McDowell's, particularly his early writings. So there's his collected, there's an edition which collects his early papers in ethics. I think it's Mind, Value, Reality. I'd recommend that. Who else? Hilary Putnam's work. In particular, when it comes to the naturalism side of my view, I'm influenced by Nicholas Sturgeon, who unfortunately never wrote a book, but has a lot of papers. And my emphasis on explanation comes from Sturgeon, so he thinks a lot about moral explanations. He also thinks a lot about supervenience, and he's worried about supervenience as well. Joseph Raz. I mean, one thing to say about all of these people is that they're not easy. I seem to be attracted to philosophers who like to be a little obscure. But I find engaging with their work particularly rewarding. A more recent book, one that I recently reviewed, is a book by Matthew Congdon called Moral Articulation. And he's not directly talking about thick concepts or supervenience or any of those things, but I think he is thinking about the same kinds of things, which is about description and about how description is an ethical matter. So his book is about new moral concepts and about noticing that the concepts that we currently have at our disposal, that's a historical contingent matter, right? We didn't always have all of the moral concepts that we have. He focuses on the examples of genocide, racism, child abuse, sexual harassment. These are all really recent concepts. And to us now, they seem like fixtures of the landscape, right? It seems like they just describe features of the world. But those concepts had to be articulated, had to come about. And his book is an exploration, I guess, of how we come up with new moral concepts and why we need them. And which goes back to what I've been saying about how moral philosophy really should pay more attention to more of the evaluative concepts that we have and stop just thinking about right and wrong and good and bad and, trolleys and that sort of thing.
Interesting. You talked about movies and novels because a lot of students will love that. What's your favorite novel and movie?
I don't have one particular favorite, so I find those kinds of questions generally really hard to answer, just because I read a lot and I watch quite a lot of films and well, actually more at the moment more series than films. I haven't watched a film. I have young children, so I haven't watched a full-length feature film for a while. I guess some of my favorite novelists, Elizabeth Strout. I really like her work. Jennifer Egan, I've just started reading her. So I really like The Visit from the Goon Squad, that novel, and I've just started reading her novel, The Candy House. Um, Films, now I'm blanking on films because it's so long since I watched one. I guess so. Series I've recently enjoyed. Um, I mean, I read the standard examples. I really like Succession. Um, I thought Succession was just a wonderful examination of certain kinds of characters and certain kinds of lifestyles. And actually, so the person who did Succession, also a film I did watch recently, by the same person, called Mountainhead, which is an investigation of a certain kind of tech billionaires. That's worth watching. Yeah. That's all that springs to mind for at the moment. But yeah, I always find those questions quite tricky.
That's interesting. That's interesting because we had one of the writer of Big Bang Theory, and he also wrote Young Sheldon for some time on a podcast. And he also did philosophy in his academic. Uh,
Oh yeah,
he has philosophy in his academic background, so that's kind of interesting of how some series, which are very sciencey,
mm-hmm.
in which are very sciencey or very focused on like younger or new generation of
Yeah,
watchers, are also kind of having an impact or having some sort of influence from what philosophy in general has been doing since long time.
yeah, yeah. Well, I think philosophy is everywhere, and I think that you can find philosophical interest in pretty much everything. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's not surprising.
Yeah, I mean, for younger generation like me, because the way we've been growing in where from the very start we've been taught categorization a lot. So when we learn categorization, it's almost it's quite difficult to sort of bridge gap or bridge concepts from one category to the other,
Mhm.
which makes it kind of interesting when there is some match from one concept to the other, from one domain to the other. It's kind of very interesting for us and engaging as well to sort of understand that, oh, we learned this is a category of something, but then it's also connected to this and also
Mm.
connected to that as well. It's just kind of interesting for us.
Yeah, I think so. Kind of related to that, I think once when you start thinking about the concepts, just the idea that there are some concepts that are evaluative, but also seem to give you a lot of concrete information about what's going on. Once you start thinking about them, you notice them everywhere across all categories, right? So quite recent concepts, which I think of when I think of them as quite recent. That are also thick. So microaggressions, people talk about body shaming or fat shaming. Those are thick concepts, I think. And they're nice examples of the kind of thing that Matthew Congdon is talking about in his book, Moral Articulation. They're new concepts, but they're moral. And they're also descriptive, right? And we use them in everyday life to characterize situations and then to make overall evaluations of people or actions or institutions and so on.
Right, right. Really interesting. So, I mean, we've touched on a lot of my questions, but one thing that I would want from you at the end is that some concept or some sort of personal or academic philosophy that has sort of influenced you a lot, other than the thick concepts, because we know that you've been working a lot on this domain, uh, has influenced you a lot, and you think that is important for younger generation to know about and think about.
Um, so I think probably what I referred to earlier, well, I mean, so there are a couple of things. So something that I've recently got really interested in because I taught a course on Iris Murdoch's Sovereignty of Good, and I was thinking about it a lot. So, Iris Murdoch has this idea that in order to see things clearly, you've got to lose yourself in some way. You've got to do what she calls unselfing. Um, and getting clear on exactly what she means by that is tricky. But one way of understanding it is that she thinks that you've got to see, and usually she's talking about people, right? You've got to see the other person in their own right for themselves without letting your ego get in the way. at all. So the process of unselfing is a kind of process of getting rid of the selfish ego and giving the object of your attention full and just attention. She talks a lot about just attention and loving attention, and that being the way to see reality clearly. And this is really interesting to me because it suggests that to get things right in an epistemic sense, in a knowing sense, in having access to reality sense, you have to be paying attention in the right kind of, ethically right kind of way. So there's a tight link there between ethics and epistemology, and between ethics and seeing the world correctly. And that, I think, is very interesting. So that's one thing that I think has had quite an impact on me recently. Another thing is so Jonathan Dancy's work in Particularism, which when I first encountered it, I was a master's student. I'd never come across the view before. When I was taught ethics as an undergraduate, it was all about principle-based views, right? Either utilitarianism or Kantianism or virtue ethics, whatever the view, principles were involved. And I found Dancy's take on ethics completely sort of changed the way that I think about how to approach moral philosophy, but also how to approach everyday, ordinary moral thinking, deciding what to do and how to live, and all those really important questions. And I think it has had quite a profound personal impact in the way that I make my own everyday decisions.
Interesting, interesting. Because we've always been told about uh, not judging someone, or there's this phrase called like you can only understand the other person's reality by being in their shoes. Sort of that's what I think you touched upon in the start.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's quite closely related to what Murdoch is on about. She intends her view to be much more wide-ranging, although she does often focus on people, and a lot of her examples concern people. I think at the end of the day, actually, she thinks that even really knowing this table involves a kind of unselfing, involves a kind of just and loving attention, which sounds weird, but I think she's a kind of Platonist, and Plato, I mean, Plato's views are complex and difficult, but Plato thought that in some sense the source of all things was goodness. And there's something of that in Murdoch's view. So she does think that metaphysics and epistemology are very closely linked to ethics. The good, the true, and the beautiful, these things are all connected. Exactly how they're connected is not always easy to work out. Murdoch is a very difficult person to understand. And if you have a look at the sovereignty of good, you'll see that, yeah, it's some really tricky stuff. But there's some great secondary literature out there now, and a lot of people working on Murdoch. Um, and yeah, I would say if you're at all interested in those kinds of ideas, I really highly recommend having a look at the sovereignty of good.
Interesting, interesting. So at the end, do you have any questions for me, or any comments on how this podcast was?
Um, well, I guess, how do you think it went? Do you think that I explained things in a way that was sufficiently accessible to a non-specialist audience, or are there any sort of technical things that I talked about that you think I should clarify?
No, I think it was very simple in terms of understanding, because uh, I used to be that kind of person who was like simplify everything in very simple language, but then I also understand that there are some properties in philosophy which loses its nuances when we oversimplify it.
Yes.
So I think that you were correctly on what needs to be simplified and what needs to be said in the way they need to be said. So I
Okay.
think, yeah, that would, I would say it was perfect for anyone who would want to start off.
Great. Yeah, I mean it's tricky to get the balance right because I mean there is always there's some simplification, but you don't want to distort things too much. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So thank you so much for doing this podcast, and it's really an honor to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was great.